Good morning and welcome everyone to this session this morning on rapid rehousing, moving from ambition to reality. A very warm welcome to you. My name is Shay Obakin and I am the Chief Executive of Centrepoint. Since 1969, Centrepoint has been supporting young people, and together with our partners, we now work with more than 14,000 young people every year all over England. Our work is not just about supported accommodation. We start with outreach teams and our national helpline, helping those who are in immediate crisis. And once young people are in supported accommodation with us, we help them to tackle health issues, especially mental health, and then offer programs which help young people to learn new skills that will support them into further education, further training, or employment. All of this delivered within psychologically informed environments so that what we do is all trauma informed. And then the tricky part, finding opportunities for them to move on into settled accommodation. So the theme of this session today touches on many of the issues that we ourselves are trying to tackle in our new strategy, which at its heart aspires to create services and partnerships that can end youth homelessness by 2037, the age that someone born today would find themselves in need of our support. Now, we know that we cannot end youth homelessness on our own. And we know that as long as rapid rehousing is just an ambition, as long as rapid rehousing does not happen, then that ambition cannot be realized. Let me tell you why. We believe that ending youth homelessness means three things. First is to work with others, indeed many in this conference today, to reduce the flow of young people becoming homeless every year. And then the second is to reach those who fall through the cracks quickly, and I emphasize quickly, and offer them effective multi-pronged support that is not just about housing, but is truly holistic. And then the final step is rapid rehousing into settled accommodation. And as we do that, to keep learning about what is working and what is not, why that is, and be ready to change rapidly. We think get all these consistently done together, we have a chance for youth homelessness to become a frictional experience. And that's what we mean. So this matters a great deal to us. And that's why I'm so pleased to be at this event today in the company of so many of you, so many people who can play a role if we are to tackle not just the problem of temporary accommodation, but to end homelessness for everyone in the long term. Now, let me be clear, the scale of the challenge is huge. There are more than 1 million households on waiting lists up and down the country. And in the last quarter for which data is available, 95,000 households in England were in temporary accommodation. In Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, that number is about 20,000. So from sources such as our own helpline, we know that the demand for accommodation has risen further during this pandemic. But even before the pandemic, our youth homelessness data bank was already telling us that 120,000 young people under 25s were in need of accommodation, approached their councils for support in 2019-20. And we think that that number would have gone worse. So we know that placing households at risk of homelessness in temporary accommodation is not just disruptive to the families, the households, the young people. It is also very expensive for local authorities. In many places, there's a commitment to rapid rehousing into more stable, permanent housing, but progress has been excruciatingly slow. Now, at that point, we're doing our bit. We're trying. Two things we're doing. First, for over 2 years now, we have been running a Housing First pilot in London. And I'm pleased to say that none of the 12 young people in that pilot have lost their home. This is a huge success because the vast majority of young people referred into it have had a succession of failed placements through their childhood and adolescence. But among several lessons we've learned, two are especially worthy of mention, I think. The first one is that finding the right accommodation can be extremely difficult. And the second one is that intensive support is not cheap. For the sake of time, just one example will suffice. One young person in the scheme fled to another city twice, and both times the support worker traveled to the other city to help them return to London so that they can continue to return to receive that service. But now we know this can work if it is properly funded. That's the first thing. At the same time, we're starting an ambitious independent living program where we're aiming to deliver over the next 5 years, 300 homes across London and Manchester for those moving on from homelessness into apprenticeships and employment. But the difference here is that we're setting the rent at roughly 30% of whatever the young person's income is. Not market, not social rent, not affordable rent, 30% of whatever they earn. That's what they will pay. So they'll settle into that accommodation without worrying about how to afford a home. And then they can think about getting better with their careers and moving on. So it's small, but we're trying bit by bit. And many others, particularly in this audience, are trying too. The issue is that progress has been slow. To get progress at scale, we need resource and we need focus. On the question of resource, I think it is important to acknowledge that the government has brought forward new funding, both in shape of those housing first pilots that I talked about, capital spending on move-on accommodation, and by most recently, for example, exempting young people living care or homelessness accommodation from the shared accommodation rate. So credit is due. But now it is absolutely critical that the government continues to invest in tackling all forms of homelessness amongst all age groups so that as charities and local authorities, we can provide the range of accommodation that is needed to actually get the job done. The key for us now will be to keep the government focused on the task at hand as we exit the pandemic, to keep this at the forefront of priorities for ministers. After all, how can we level up the country if we leave so many people behind? So the question for our panel today is how do we push the issue of temporary housing up the agenda and turn rapid rehousing into reality? And we are lucky. We're lucky to have a thoroughly eminent panel here today to kick off the discussion. Dr. Pete Markey, he'll introduce himself later on, is Research Associate at the Center for Homelessness Impact and is a reader in the School of Geography and Planning at Cardiff. Johan Aitken is CEO of Cyrenians, which incidentally were involved with Reverend Ken Leach in establishing Centrepoint in the first place. I bet you didn't know that. Maybe you did know that. Neil Monster is the Active Inclusion and Service Manager for Newcastle City Council. Nikki Etchison is Head of Employment Development Project at Aspire. And Hannah will bring some lived experience to the conversation. So can I start by inviting Pete to introduce himself then and tell us what rapid rehousing actually means? Pete.
Thanks, A, and good to be here this morning. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes setting the context, really, and then handing over to far more expert folk who will talk about how rapid rehousing is working on the ground. So you've already talked about and put rapid rehousing alongside housing first, and I think that's our first point of definition, is that both of those sit within this kind of wider shift and policy turn towards housing-led responses that are different from our traditional staircase response, where folk are spending long periods of time in temporary accommodation, often unsuitable temporary accommodation. And so that's the shift into this kind of spectrum of housing-led responses. And there are big differences. So housing first is typically used with folk experiencing higher support needs, and rapid rehousing tends to be used with those with lower support needs. But actually it's with housing first that there's way more written about what we mean, and there's way more evidence about whether it works and who it works for. There's far less in terms of rapid rehousing. But we know, and we're bought into the idea around rapid rehousing, that we should move to permanent, safe, secure, suitable accommodation swiftly, understanding that temporary accommodation could be harmful. The second point I want to make is that, look, this has been, we're pushing against an open door, and say you mentioned this, in all three GB nations, governments had made a commitment to rapid rehousing. So Scotland through the HARSAG, Wales as a result of the Homeless Action Group, and in England in 2018, commitments were made to pursue rapid rehousing. But it's in Scotland where we've seen this actually move forward. We're talking in this session about moving at pace. There's been more activity, more action in Scotland. I'm looking forward to hearing kind of a bit more detail about how that's going on the ground from Ewan. So there's a policy commitment there. But it's also really interesting to note, and I've struggled with this when I've tried to look at the data on rapid rehousing, is in England and Wales, we've got legislation which by default was trying to drive swift housing solutions. So the 56-day limit on a relief duty, it was intended to work in line with the principles of rapid rehousing. But we've not really interrogated the extent to which that's working and who for. But the point is, it's on our policy agenda, and then today we talk about moving faster. The kind of the main point I want to make now, before handing over, is around the evidence base and a little bit on the definition. Now, if I pose the question in the chat bar, and I'm going to, and we'll get loads of comments. Sorry, Richard. How fast is rapid? What do we mean by rapid? Go on, have a go. See if you can answer. Let's see what variation we get. How fast is rapid? None of us have actually asked that question. And then we complicate that and we go, how important is the difference in speed? Oh, nobody's actually putting it in our chat bar yet, but how important is that speed? Is there a cutoff from 30, 60, 90, 120 days in temporary accommodation before rapid becomes, or before slow becomes problematic? We don't know. We just don't know at the moment. I'm going to try and fill some of that evidence gap shortly. In the US, they use a benchmark of 30 days. So HUD in the US uses 30 days. And in the US, there's a bit more written on rapid rehousing. So 30 days, I can see in the chat, we're getting 15 days coming up, 30 days. In the largest US study, because we don't really have any in the UK, the average days between enrollment into a rapid rehousing program and being rehoused was 45 days. So far away from the couple of weeks that's coming up in our chat. But here's the interesting bit. In our most progressive nation, when it comes to homes policy, and there's no doubt about that's Scotland in GB, is we've done some recent analysis. We've got some data from Scottish Government. And in 2019-20, less than 1 in 5 homeless households in Scotland were offered permanent accommodation in under 60 days. So less than 1 in 5 homeless households in Scotland were offered permanent accommodation in under 60 days. And there's huge variability between local authorities. So the median, so the middle offer of accommodation, took from 62 to 779 days, depending on which local authority you're in. Now, there's all sorts of caveats to this. And this is the important point, is if we just focus on speed, we miss half the story. And I think other colleagues are going to talk to this in way more detail. Because actually in Scotland, the temporary accommodation offer is often quite suitable, and we're flipping tenancies. It's the same accommodation that you remain in. So there's a whole load of questions about whether it's problematic or not. But it's important to recognise that all these are questions we still haven't answered, and yet we're pursuing a rapid rehousing agenda. I think I'm going to leave it there. I've spoken for long enough, but posed a few questions around that we might want to get into a wee bit later. Thanks, A.
Thank you very much, Pete. I'd really love to get into that question of what does rapid actually mean, so that we can frame the ambition. Thank you very much. Can I invite Neil to share with us the perspective of a local authority? Neil.
Yeah. Hello. I hope you can hear me. I've had to revert to my phone because of a connection issue. But yeah, I'm Neil Munslow. I'm from Newcastle City Council, and I'm the service manager for what we call active inclusion, which is about trying to create the conditions for a stable life. And I think, as is alluded to, that responding to homelessness isn't just about responding to housing. So our Stable Life acronym is about somewhere to live, an income, financial inclusion, and employment opportunities, responding to those interconnected demands of the welfare reforms in particular, which have had a hugely adverse impact in Newcastle, taking £119 million out of the welfare system just in Newcastle. So our approach is, wherever possible, to prevent homelessness, to use case finding, to understand our residents' needs, and not to create the self-fulfilling prophecy that we build everything around a crisis presentation. And we were fortunate to get the Gold Award from the World Habitat last year, and they said of Newcastle, the judges said Newcastle's approach has prevented over 24,000 households from becoming homeless since 2014. Poverty and deprivation were already long-standing issues in the city before a decade-long programme of austerity. And that approach of aligning our support has helped us to understand demand and match that to supply. But I think, as Peter was explaining there, we still have a lot of questions to answer in terms of being more supply driven. But in doing that, it helps us to predict individual need and to respond to that. So particularly using debt, and our strapline is to move from collection to connection, using debt as an opportunity to prevent and reduce those crisis presentations. We want to work, we go beyond the government requirement to provide suitable and sustainable accommodation, which is closer to perhaps a right to shelter, and that we want to have suitable and sustainable homes. So helping people keep their home once they get it, rather than that cycle of rehousing. But we know we can't predict all crisis and prevent all crisis. So we seek to have sufficient headroom within our system to respond to those crises that we can't predict. And having dedicated resources and processes that facilitate rapid rehousing. So we have 779 commissioned rooms, which is part of that supply that we want to move resource from the traditional homeless sector. They're all self-contained rooms, many en suite. They housed 1,147 people last year, and we only had 35 families in temporary accommodation at our last snapshot, which I think is remarkable when you compare with, say, Birmingham, that had 6,000 families at the same time, and that we had, and we've got over 1,000 refugees placed in Newcastle. So that predictive work of having accommodation available to meet demand, and we're moving more and more towards that and taking away from response to crisis and more to having supply that can meet and sustain housing needs. So we have 95 Housing First placements in development. We've got 56 dedicated flats for people who've come through a rough sleeping route, and we've got 26,000 council homes that are dedicated towards meeting the needs of residents in the city. And processes that align to that, and I think one of the silver linings that came out of the pandemic and the ban on non-crisis housing moves was that we established an emergency housing panel. And between the 30th of March and the 19th of June, when that ban was on, 189 households were rapidly rehoused into permanent accommodation. We built on that. We've worked with the Design Council to create a visualization for the city of bridging the gap between homelessness and general needs accommodation, and established move-on panels and complex case handles that bring together social care colleagues, housing colleagues, and the homeless sector colleagues to look at rapidly rehousing those people with needs, and so that they can have suitable and sustainable accommodation, and make those collective decisions together and compromises, because we can't change our supply overnight, but we can use that learning to improve our supply. And we've also got, again, related to the pandemic, we've established Collaborative Newcastle, a much stronger partnership with health. And one of the straplines within that is moving from duplication to personalisation. So when we know we've got common clients who appear regularly in crisis in the health system and the housing system. It's about maximising the value of our collective resources to sustain those people in the community. And that builds on our case finding approach, not waiting for people to approach us, but approaching people. So when we know people have had a shock in their lives, they've lost income through maybe the benefit cap, or they've had a bereavement, or they've lost a job, that we go to the person rather than wait for them to approach us in crisis. And lastly, that in doing this, we have a strong political leadership and a structured process of review. So the statutory requirement is to have a homelessness review every 5 years. In Newcastle, we seek to have quarterly reviews where we present our evidence, we present our challenges and our exception reports, and then work with the sector under the leadership of our politicians to provide solutions which helps us better bid for money and to make more of our existing resource so that we can both respond to crisis, but ultimately what we want to do is help people and for them to have suitable and sustainable homes. So I'll stop there, and I hope that's been of some use to you. And through the Centre for Homelessness Impact, I can share things like the Design Council work and web links so people can see more information and more detail about what I've tried to describe here. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Neil. We did hear you loud and clear. I could see in the chat that Alex and Judith are making the point about supply, and you talked about that as well as pulling together your collective resources to tackle the problem. But I think it seems to me that the key in what you were talking about there is leadership, and actually the strength of the political leadership and the accountability for it is what makes the difference. And that's a good segue actually to go to Ewan to talk to us a little bit about tying supported housing together in a holistic way. What do you see in Ewan? You're on mute. There.
So thanks very much, it's been a delight to be here and already to hear what's been said and a number of things kind of connect in there. As Peter mentioned, the Harsag report led to the End Homelessness Together plan for the Scottish Government, and interestingly we've had a recent election, but that has transferred over from one government to the next because it's the same party, and that's been great. They've been consistent with that. And what they've driven forward this with is a programme of rapid rehousing transition plans in every local authority, which is to tie together not just the work of local authorities, but the third sector and even the business sector. And I'll come back to that in a moment. What's really interesting is that idea of driving forward the mindset change that is involved in this. You know, you were very complimentary about what we're doing, Peter, and I was grateful to you for that. But the truth is we have a long way to go to shift it completely, because it's in people's heads and in the hardwiring of how they perceive why problems happen, as much as how we reconfigure the resources. But the rapid rehousing transition plans allow for a consistent approach in terms of objectives across the country. All 32 authorities have to produce one, whilst each local area being able to provide the thing that's nuanced for its circumstances. And I'll come back to some of the challenges that are faced with that. You know, what you need in Orkney is not what you need in Glasgow. And you need to be able to give people the space to have that difference. But it has allowed us for a level of accountability. So I sit on the Scottish Government's Rapid Rehousing Transition Plan Delivery Subgroup, catchiest title winner there. But it provides that cross-fertilisation of information and accountability and drive and sharing a good practice. And that's helped by the fact that the 32 authorities are divided into 5 housing option hubs. And they've been collaborating a lot in the producing of these, because they realise that everybody's got to do it. And by working together, it's better than just defending their thing and try to compete to be the best against others. And that has been a real mindset shift already I've seen in the production of this. Of course, at the heart of this, it was referenced earlier as Housing First, but there's a constant reminder that it's much more than Housing First. Although Housing First does give you some of the principles of system change and mindset change that you require, and some of them we referred to earlier. But the primary thing for this to work is, as Housing First reminds us, is it's about the relationships that are required to get people to where they need to get to on their terms, rather than just the provision of resources more quickly. The question is, how fast is rapid is a really interesting one in that context. So we lead the Consortium for Housing First in Edinburgh. We've created 120 tenancies. We're supporting 164 people. The average time to get people into the right housing, and supply is one of the biggest issues in Edinburgh, is around 120 days. And in some cases, it's been much longer than that. That's a huge challenge, but that hasn't meant that people have languished to getting nothing, because there's a relationship being built in that period. And of course, one of the consequences of that has meant that it's been successful. So we've not had one eviction, not just in Edinburgh, but right across Scotland in over 500 tenancies with Housing First since we started. But Housing First isn't a magic bullet. It is a very good example of the attitude we need to have, but we need much more than that, because there's a wide variety of need. And that's what we need about system change and the level of collaboration that we require. Now, Neil mentioned the benefits from COVID. One of the ones we've had is that we shifted everybody into hotels. We had 5 hotels in Edinburgh with 700 people in them, did similar in Glasgow and in other places. And we realized quite quickly the impact of being in a hotel rather than a congregate pop-up night shelter was quite significant in the level of engagement you got from folk who were in that circumstance. So much so that when the first lockdown was finished and we moved out the hotels, instead of setting up another night shelter, we set up, it was one of our colleagues, Bethany Trust, who set that up, and we support them with a council and with the government, block booking 65 beds in a hotel. And of the 830 people who used that facility between October last year and May this year, 83% went on to appropriate accommodation, which is quite extraordinary in itself. Now, of course, when you ask folk why that was, it said because there was a level of dignity about the provision. They knew where their meals were going to be coming from. They weren't getting kicked out at 7 o'clock in the morning. They knew what they were going to be doing. And the people who they needed to talk to came to them. This is all blindingly obvious stuff, but actually it takes sometimes something like a pandemic for people to work out that that's the way it works. And, you know, if I'd said to the council in February 2020, what you need to do is dump the night shelters and book a hotel, they'd tell me to take a run and jump. Now they've booked it for next year because they've seen that that works. And it's that combination of those two things that has made a difference, the pandemic and the drive to rapid rehousing. We've also looked at the private rented sector as a potential solution for some of the issues that we have to deal with. And we've set up a project that has done that in partnership with Crisis, and we've housed 25 people in houses that became available largely because there aren't the tourists in Edinburgh that there used to be because of the pandemic, and the LHA went up enough for that to become a possible argument. But we're also seeing amongst landlords are saying, well, if I could do this in the long term, I'd like to do that because I could do some good with what I'm doing. And frankly, even with the challenges of having somebody requiring support, that might be less. We're hearing from some of them the challenges of managing Airbnb would have to change all the time. And actually, that can be quite damaging on their property too. So interesting conversation going on there to access that service. Of course, one of the challenges we have in Edinburgh, and it's been referenced early, is that we have a huge problem with supply of affordable housing. Shelter did a analysis that showed that 60% of the demand for private sector housing, for affordable housing, and social housing in Scotland is in Edinburgh. But because of the way the grant is distributed at present to support that the grant, Edinburgh only gets 9% of the grant. So there's some huge issues, which is why that we're not in the situation Neil is in, and we have about 4,000 people in temporary accommodation, a lot of which is good, and we're beginning the process of flipping because we can then get to that point. But there's a huge bit of system change stuff to go on in that space to get us to where we need to get to, and we need a very different supply of housing in the longer term to get there. But fundamentally, what we know and what we continue to reiterate is that rapid rehousing isn't about speed or housing. Actually, it's about making sure you've got the right person-centered approach that can provide the resources at the right level of speed so that somebody can still be in the relationships they require to get the support they require. It's not just about counting the number of days to say, how's it worked? But did somebody flourish in the journey? And were they in a position where they could flourish where previously they couldn't? It isn't just about a roof and a bed. It's about a whole person approach. And getting there quickly enough isn't the answer, because as I'm sure you've heard once long before, this is about homelessness, not houselessness. Homelessness is about being in a place where you belong and you feel like you matter. And rapid rehousing, although it has that sense of urgency about it, so you don't cause problems by people being in somewhere too long that's not suitable, you need to make sure that you're building in all the other bits that make sure it is about the person and not the house that is the priority. And that's what we're still grappling with in Scotland. Thank you very much. And I'll hand you back to Si. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I mean, you touch on there something that is a bit of a hobby horse for me. This is homelessness. It's not houselessness. And to deal with homelessness, you actually need to be thinking about relationships. You need to be thinking about dignity. You need to be thinking about the person. And all of those, I think, are absolutely crucial to solving the problem. But actually, it's also a good way for us to move on to Nikki, actually, because you've been doing some stuff that is not about houselessness, but about homelessness. Would you like to tell us a little bit about that, Nikki?
Yeah, thank you very much. So my name's Nicky Aitchison, and I work for Aspire Oxford. So we're an employment and homelessness charity based in Oxford. So my role's mostly around sort of integrated employment support, focusing on well-being, social prescribing, working with drug and alcohol services, homelessness sector, and it's about sort of trying to help people achieve some sort of sustainability longer term, looking at how you can sort of build up some of the life skills and starting to sort of build purpose and things, because that's, as we've sort of touched on, everybody's mentioned earlier, obviously housing and looking at the systems that are sort of perpetuating some of the cycles that have got us in this situation at the moment. It does need to look at some of the other things that make it more sustainable around relationships. So we're doing quite a lot of work at the moment around sort of housing-led approaches, housing first, and we've just recognised a big sort of gap. And just to paint the picture a bit, just about Oxfordshire and what that sort of looks like at the moment, it's that for quite a while there's been quite a lot of sort of hostels. A lot of the support that's been provided, it's been around sort of like achieving outcomes. A lot of the metrics and measurements are quite sort of, they've been like deficit, I suppose, in some sort of areas, but it recognised a big sort of need to do something differently. So I'm also co-founder a LEAF group, which is Lived Experience Advisory Forum. There was a big gap in provision around co-production in Oxfordshire. So we set that up and it's been going well. It's been, really busy, and there's a massive need for it. So we worked with Crisis and Imaging Blood on a feasibility study to look into sort of housing-led approaches and just different ways in looking at the systems that we currently had and what sort of alternatives there would be. And one of those things that we done was with the LEAF group, we went out to ask everybody, because it's great, like all these sort of ideas, and every area is different, people are different, and people are individuals. So we really need to look at them as that. So we went out and we had some peer-led researchers. Like if I go up and try and speak to somebody that's had a bad experience of the system, they'll not want to speak to me. I'll not actually get anywhere, but if it's somebody that they can relate to, that they've probably knew for a long time, they'll be open and honest, and we'll get the feedback that we actually want. So like looking in Oxfordshire, what we identified, a lot of the barriers people said, rent arrears as a result of going into supported accommodation, they can accrue very quickly, and that then becomes a massive barrier for anybody wanting to move on, and that's something we really need to change. Looking at past evictions and all that sort of bad behaviour and all these sort of things that people get sort of judged on and the risk, all that needs changing as well. So we've been looking at that, and also a lot of the assumptions by staff. I think having a clear sort of programme and a clear message about exactly what the housing offer is and what's the process if you want to go forward for that, because it can become quite complex and messy, not just for the people that are in it, but also for staff. So it can feel like people have got too many jumps to jump through, and there's no tangible goals actually you can sort of work towards achieving your own house. Around good support and what people wanted, it was privacy and space. So if you can imagine being in a supported accommodation where somebody can come and sort of chap on your room, or if you're in a hostel, it's about people and normalising a lot of this situation and seeing people as individuals. We can't just sort of go around and sort of expect to be sort of intrusive, or I think even looking at power dynamics within sort of supported accommodation and stuff as well, it has an impact on people that they don't have any sort of choice, control, options are limited. And this are the common themes that sort of came back for this. Also a lack of stigma and judgment, that's what people sort of reported quite a lot. And a lot of people wanted peer support, and a lot of people wanted to get into some of these peer support roles as well. They say they can just relate to people so much more. And echoing what Ewan said as well, relationships. I can sort of speak a little bit as well. In my early 20s in Edinburgh, I experienced my own sort of homelessness. I was in a B&B for about 3.5 years. And for me, in my journey, it was the right relationships with people that you could be open with, that you trusted enough when you're sort of going through a difficult time. So it's that is sort of crucial, is that you've got the right people building the right relationships that aren't sort of bogged down with outcomes, the pressures of work, and all that sort of stuff. It's really that needs to become the main priority, and that echoed in this study that we've done as well. And also, people want, as I mentioned at the start, sustainability and looking at what's your sort of goals, what's your aspirations, where do you want to go, how do we take manageable, small, realistic steps to actually get there as well. And that takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes listening. But if you can get that, we will look at sort of resolving some of these problems. And just to, I suppose that was what sort of came out of it. So for us, we definitely need to go. That points towards us as a system in Oxfordshire. It points towards housing-led rapid rehousing, and that the model that we currently have, it's just not sort of fit for purpose. So there's a huge appetite. And LEAF, so the Lived Experience Advisory Forum, it sits as part of Oxfordshire Homeless Movement on the steering group. And what that is, it's a collaborative approach with local authorities and charities, where we sit together and we meet, and it's looking about filling the gaps in provision, looking around doing fundraising. So for example, I think one of my colleagues will be speaking later today around people with no recourse to public funds and how we can sort of fund stuff like that as well. So I think it's about collaboration and tapping into what you've got locally within your community as well. What resources have you got? Oxford's got a lot of universities, for example. It's got a lot of wealth, it's got a lot of good intentions, and people want to do good. How do you channel that? How do you create sort of opportunities for people to really get involved and do their bit in a strategic and targeted way as well? So yeah, so that's mostly it for us. There's currently gone through a new sort of tendering system in Oxfordshire, looking at more an alliance model, inspired for other places that are doing good stuff. And yeah, just really, I think it's been good to come along today as well and sort of hear other people, because everybody's sort of coming for the same sheet, but recognising like other areas are doing stuff. So I think it's really important to continue that, tapping into that sort of wider network as well, and just share stuff and see how other people are doing it. And I suppose as Centre for Homelessness Impact say, it's about sort of evidence and proving it as well. And most importantly, about the people that are in there and bridging the gap so that communication is happening with people that are experiencing homelessness. If somebody doesn't want to engage in any sort of system or service, you need the right people to find out why and what we can do differently. So I'll leave it there and then just hand it back over.
Thank you very much again there, Nikki. You're picking up some of the threads of, that I'm hearing there, things like stigma, judgment, dignity. I think dignity is really important. And I think all of this, the point about privacy and space actually is consistent with the point Alex Redfern is making in the chat about actually finding suitable housing offers for different people, because it will be different for different groups of people. And to the point about how people actually feel as to how the system currently treats them, it would be great now actually for us to hear from Hannah, who would share with us a little bit from lived experience. Hannah?
Hi, yeah, so I'm the lived experience specialist at the Centre for Homelessness Impact. I'm also an author as well. So I'm gonna echo a few of the things that have already been said. I'm also going to try and add some extra thinking points. So the first thing I want to say is that, and something I've picked up on, is as a young person especially, but for anyone, every day without a settled home matters. And when you're in a space where you don't have a settled home, where you don't know where you're going to be sleeping tomorrow night, or that in 2 weeks you've got to leave where you're staying, you can't focus on anything else other than that. You can't think past that point. And that can be, so for me, I've experienced trauma, and a lot of people who've experienced homelessness have also experienced trauma. And when you're in that situation, it's re-traumatizing, and it triggers a lot of things. And I think one of the big things is you can't start to deal with any of the trauma or the bad stuff or if you're using drugs and alcohol to cope, which is completely understandable. You can't start to deal with that until you're in settled accommodation. You know, I was put in a hostel with 19. There was 19 of us, all under the age of 25. Everyone had experiences of trauma. They were struggling mentally. We were using drugs and alcohol to cope. But how are any of us supposed to start to deal with any of that, living in such a chaotic environment? So I think there's a big thing here about like trauma-informed and psychologically informed environments, and not re-traumatizing people. Like a few people have said, like relationships as well. That's a massive thing. You know, when you're going from one service to another, or one type of accommodation to another, and you're passed from worker to worker, it's not helpful. And you start to open up to someone, you start to build a relationship with someone, and then you're passed on, or you're told that you're too complex, or whatever it is. So I think relationships is a massive point in this. You know, if we can house someone rapidly, whatever that means, and have relationships, stable relationships from the beginning, that's going to make a massive difference. You know, if I was rehoused rapidly, I mean, I wouldn't be sat here today, but it would have made a massive difference. You know, a year of my life wouldn't have been so chaotic and so all over the place. I think there's another point here around like the cost of temporary accommodation and different forms of temporary accommodation as well. So the hostel I was staying in, they got £240 a week in housing benefit from whoever, but that's per young person. So, I mean, I'm bad at maths. That's a lot of money, but that was, you know, I'm guessing the amount was because it was supported. But actually, when you look at what support was in place, it you know, I have a lot of questions about that. And I think that money could be used in lots of different ways. For example, you know, rehousing people quickly. And in the long run, that's going to save us a lot of money. Again, don't ask me to do the maths. Yeah, so I think they're my main points. Limiting trauma, choices, giving people control over their own situation as well. When you've experienced trauma and you're told to do something, for me at least, when I was told you must do this, you must do that, I kind of thought, nah, I'm not gonna do that. And I think we have to look at why people behave like that. Why, you know, the way someone behaves is impacted by their experiences, and I think we need to remember that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I mean, you are echoing all the things that a lot of us people have been saying, but actually it's great to hear it from your perspective. Every day without a settled home is another day in which you cannot focus on anything else. It's another day in which your life is in suspense. It's another day in which you can't build the relationships that you need to help you move on. It's another day where you don't have that sort of person-centered help that you need to help you move on. We've got a few more minutes now to, you know, discuss this with you, the audience. Please tell us what you think about what you've been hearing. Why do we continue to rely on temporary accommodation rather than taking a housing-led approach? We've had questions. What does even rapid housing, what does it mean? And what is the point of rapid housing if it is not person-centered, if it isn't allied with the ultimate goal that the person is flourishing? And I've heard things like collaboration today. How can we promote greater collaboration between different stakeholders, governments, providers, academics, and so on and so forth? I think in this area, the Center for Homelessness Impact can actually be really helpful to us all. But how can we promote that better? So we're learning from each other, we're learning what works, and we can amplify that, we'll do what works. Can you think of examples where, you know, light touch support services have been delivered alongside housing effectively? A bit like Nikki and Johan have been describing today. What's the place of data a better understanding and a better use of data to help us all move people along. We want to hear from you. We've got 10, 15 minutes. Please, off you go. We're all ears. Right? Somebody says most people in hostel accommodation need not be there. What, my panel, do you think might be an alternative to hostel accommodation? Just thinking a little bit about the points that Hannah was making, particularly around moving from one hostel to the other. What is the alternative? Can I come to you, Ian?
So I think that we need to have a series of alternatives. That's the point. So in my own organisation, that we've got 5 different forms of residential community, targeted largely but not entirely at young people, where folk can get that space to do the thinking that Hannah was talking about in a supported way, and in living in community and a shared life, you have the opportunity in learning to look after each other. You learn to look after yourself, and that's a space that's not. It's absolutely not for everybody, but it works. For those for whom that is what they need. They need not something permanent, but it needs to be settled for as long as it needs to be. So we have you don't have to leave after a length of time. So the longest we've had somebody staying there is 4 years, and other people have stayed much shorter lengths of time. But people are in charge of their how long they stay, and that's really, I think, the most important thing, because that's the other thing to remember: is settled isn't always forever. We all, move houses for different reasons. It's about the agency to decide when it is you move that is key, rather than saying, right, I've got you sorted and this has to suit you for everything. Because if your life evolves, then other things have to evolve as well. And I noticed also that in the chat, somebody was asking about, how do we get other types of housing resources? So one example was access in the private rented sector. I really think we need to look long and hard at that. There are challenges to that, but I think there's an opportunity just now, and we're piloting this, as I said, and we're looking with the Scottish Government to actually roll this out across Scotland. So providing supported accommodation that has support and is clear about the support that's required, but in the private rented sector. Because as well as waiting for new houses to be built, I need to do stuff now. And the other thing that we've been working with is 2 different social investment organisations to see whether we can start buying into the house building that is going on, so that instead of waiting for stuff to be built and then see if we can access it, actually saying, could we invest in it ourselves? I also know another organisation in Edinburgh called Simon Community have just got an investment of £5 million to buy 30 houses, to buy 40 houses on a similar programme. The investment lasts for 10 years, and then they'll get mortgages to continue that. So they're able to provide support and provide the accommodation, which I think is really important. And we're also look at other kind of investment models, and I know there's other organisations who are doing it on a kind of borrow pay bit. However, the challenge we have in Edinburgh is the size of the issue is so enormous. We're talking 5 figures worth of houses needed every year, and our capacity to get close to that is limited. And we need a reconfiguring of the way the grant is given so that Edinburgh can build it, and that's before we deal with the price of land.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me just go to this question from Sophie. How should we support those who have experienced the trauma and dehumanization of being moved from place to place without them having a choice in the matter? I think that this question, we should think about it also in relation to the previous comment about investing in support workers. What does investing in support workers actually look like? Is it just about paying support workers more, or is it more than that? And if it is more than that, how do we persuade funders to recognize that actually we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we don't do this, because those 2 things are connected? Can I come to you, Pete? What are your thoughts on this?
I think Nikki and Hannah are far better on this one than me, but I'll just say one point is, 5 years ago when I was doing studies, this barely came up in conversation. Now every bit of work I'm involved in, frontline staff are at the core of every conversation. So there's been a really positive shift, I think. Either that or conditions have got so bad for our frontline support workers that the issue is raised up the agenda. I'm not entirely sure which of those is, but either way, there is a lot of focus here. It came up, most of you won't have bothered reading the Homelessness Action Group recommendations from Wales, but front and foremost of that is a set of recommendations around frontline staff. And COVID taught us a little bit about how badly respected and regarded our frontline staff are. They weren't able to get into the hubs for the kids because they weren't seen as key workers. They weren't getting access to the PPE that was going elsewhere. So it really laid bare the low profile of our key workers. But I think things are starting to change. I think there's a realization that something needs to happen, and it comes with pay, remuneration, but it also comes with support, training, not commissioning services that require that individual to be supporting somebody every hour of their paid time, because actually you need psychological support for those frontline workers because of the vicarious traumas they go through. And that's the direction of travel that some organizations are able to somehow find the funding to do that and to create that space. But so there's lots to be done. And remember that supporting people, was the main budget for that. That got decimated, disappeared in England. It's disappearing more or less in Scotland, is still ring fenced in some shape in Wales. And you do see the difference in terms of support there. That's all I've really got to say. Hannah and Nikki would be way better placed, I think.
And indeed, I'd love to hear from Hannah and Nikki. Can I come to you first, Hannah, on this one? Because I think it's really, really critical to getting things right for people.
Yeah, so there's a few things on this. So I'm going to go back to my time in the hostel. Some of the staff were lovely, and some of them had great intentions. But did they have training in things like how to deal with someone in a mental health crisis, or how to deal with a young person who wanted to hurt themselves? They didn't. And that we could tell, we knew that. And I think another thing here is like the trauma-informed label. How many places are sending staff on a day-long course or a few day-long course and then labeling the service as trauma-informed? Like, it's got to be like a mindset and a culture rather than just a day-long course and then a label that you stick on the organization or the service or the charity or whatever. And I guess the other part of the question was around like what I can't remember the other part of the question, but the bit around what we think the solution is. I personally think the solution is dispersed accommodation, because if you put, even if you'd have put 4 of us from the hostel in a flat together, it would have still been chaos. It would have just been, at the time, it just seemed like a party all the time. Looking back, it wasn't healthy at all. But that would have just carried on with a smaller group of us. So I think, dispersed accommodation, but then making sure that the individual is able to integrate into the community and link in with people and things that interest them. And for me, a massive thing has been linking in with an organization called Camarados, who are massive on community. And that has made like the world of difference. And if people can connect with things like that, and find people that are like them, I think that will make a massive difference.
Nikki?
Yeah, sorry, echoing what both Peter and Hannah said there as well. And I think that one of the barriers as well is around pay, I think, for staff. It's around being commissioned and the expectation around how much work you've sort of got to do. Because I think for a lot, I know I've sort of experienced this as well, you've got whatever a high number of sort of caseload, and try to get round and see everybody. It's just pressured, it's fast. I think one other thing as well is, I think it's around sort of like the processes and some of the sort of risk assessments and the way that you identify with people when you first meet them. And this has came up quite a bit recently as well with some people that have sort of spoke about saying that when you sort of get to know people, because I think sometimes it can be, they're this risk, they use this drug, they do this thing, mental health problems, and that's how sometimes people get identified. And I think that for support workers who have probably got the best intentions, but that's the paperwork and the processes that they have to run by, I think that needs to get looked at again, because it should be about sort of building relationships first. Like if I met somebody, all right, how are you getting on? What music do you like? Do you watch the football? That's how I'd probably start a conversation. But I think when you're going through a difficult time and you're asked about past sort of experiences, homelessness and all that sort of stuff, it's, yeah, the experience isn't good for the person. And sorry, I'll just chip in a wee bit as well. One thing is, we were looking at Relief, it was around, because you touched on data, we're looking at sort of like storytelling methodology. So it's understanding and use that as an evaluation tool to find out, from a person's perspective, what's meaningful, what is meant to them. So it's not about sort of data. Now, obviously, you need the data and the outcomes, and you need to prove it. But I think for an emotional side and looking at the person, people being able to tell their story about what worked, whatever they want. And I think that's something that we're keen to see more as well, more sort of emotion in it, and more, yeah, it's all about the people.
Thank you very much indeed, Nikki. I was hoping to go to Judith's question, because I think that's a challenge for us, but I think it's probably a challenge that we must take away, because we got 3 more minutes. But let me try to pull together what I think we're talking about here. I think what we're saying is rapid rehousing is important, but it is not just about setting a time goal. Because actually, if you just move people along with a time goal, that doesn't help them to be established, to flourish, to be the people that they can be, to aspire. So rapid rehousing is important, but it isn't just about timelines. It's also about having the right relationships around people. It's about having a person-centered approach that starts with that person that you're trying to help, what matters to them, how can we help them to get there on their own terms. I have that used, on their own terms, because it is those things that bring the sense of dignity, that bring the sense of helping people to move on in a way that means that they can be proud of themselves. We're not doing things to them, we're doing things with them. And I think that really is important. We've heard about how the quality of those relationships can be compromised when people are moved around often, changing from one hostel to the other, to the other, to the other. And so there's something here that is about investing properly in support workers, not just about pay. Pay is really, really important, but also about training. Hannah made the point, I think it's a really important point, that being trauma-informed is about culture. It's not just about a one-day training program. And then we've heard about shared accommodation and how that can have challenges for privacy, for space, and actually how it can be discouraging. And yet we do know that there is a serious dearth of single accommodation. So what more can we do about that? Neil spoke earlier on about supply. I think that's really, really important that we figure out what sort of supply we need and begin to make a change in that space. Can I therefore close this conference and leave you with Judith's challenge? Does this problem need us to challenge politically more strongly the issue of under-occupation and underuse of homes? And that's a challenge that we should all take away. Thank you all for coming along today. I hope we've all learned something. This is really crucial. Collaboration is really important if we are to get somewhere. But thank you. It's been such a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, thanks. Cheers.